Greetings to the brethren in love, and I'd like to continue this story and the passage that we looked at last week, which is from the First King, the story of First Kings, the story of Elijah. What should I say? Maybe I could say the test of his faith. That's what this passage is about. And I'm going to be reading you from chapter 17, a couple of verses. In fact, I'm going to be reading 1 Kings 17, 7 through the end. There's going to be familiar passages in there, but it's good to reread it. And it came to pass after a while that the brook dried up, because there had been no rain in the land. And the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, Arise and get thee to Zarephath, which belongeth to Zidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain thee. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow woman was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Fetch me, I pray thee, a little water in the vessel, that I might drink. And as she was going to fetch it, he called to her and said, Bring me, I pray thee, a morsel of bread in thine hand. And she said, As the Lord thy God liveth, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel, and a little oil in a cruse. And behold, I'm gathering 2 sticks, that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die. And Elijah said unto her, Fear not, go and do as thou hast said, but make me thereof a little cake first, and bring it unto me, and after make for thee and for thy son. For thus saith the Lord, God of Israel, the barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth. And she went and did according to the saying of Elijah. And she and he and her house did eat many days. And the barrel of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Elijah. And it came to pass, after these things, that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, fell sick, and his sickness was so sore that there was no breath left in him. And she said unto Elijah, What have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? Art thou come unto me to call my sin to remembrance, and to slay my son? And he said unto her, Give me thy son. And he took him out of her bosom, and carried him up into the loft where he abode, and laid him upon his own bed. And he cried unto the Lord, and said, O Lord my God, hast thou also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourned by slaying her son? And he stretched himself upon the child 3 times, and cried unto the Lord, and said, O Lord my God, I pray thee, let this child's soul come into him again. And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child, and brought him down out of the chamber into the house, and delivered him unto his mother. And Elijah said, See, thy son liveth. And the woman said to Elijah, Now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in thy mouth is truth. Our God, we ask you to please bless this story for us. Help us to understand your message. Please talk to us through this and form us. Amen. Well, how does God provide? First, it might seem God's great man for us are in an unreachable distance. There's a certain halo over them. They're walking above the ground by 30 centimeters. And they're a little bit like God's superheroes that just cut right through the problems, the callings, the missions. And none of that really means a big problem. Of course, sometimes there are fire furnaces and den of lions, but they basically stand their ground, they do their job, and they're a great man of God. What else would they be? They're chosen by God, and they're in the Bible. And then you can read in James that Elijah was a man subject to like passion as we are. Well, basically it's difficult to imagine that. Because these prophets and these heroes are so highly exalted that they totally lose touch with our reality, and we don't know what to do with them. We marvel at them. We recognize that, yes, there have been such great men before, but where are we compared to these? But then the Holy Writer says he was just a man subject to like passion as we are. Well, maybe throughout this story we're going to find out that things didn't quite always work out for Elijah either. He didn't just cut right through every trial and problem untouched. He's got challenges, he's got needs, he's got problems, and he's got doubts that he needs to struggle with. He needs to make decisions. And sometimes the question arises, should I even go on? Should I obey God? Does it even make sense? What kind of needs could Elijah have to this great prophet? You remember the story from last week when we read the beginning of the story. We saw that Elijah shows up in front of the king and his wife Jezebel, Ahab and his wife Jezebel, and he announces bad news that for quite a while there's going to be no rain now. And well, we know that kings and rulers don't appreciate bad news, but it was especially true in the olden days. And in Elijah, the thought might have surfaced that I understand it's all right, I have to stand before the king, but what is he going to say? Will I even survive that encounter? And it's possible that this was his first doubt. If you watch this, if you read carefully this whole chapter 17, Elijah's story, you could almost interpret this or read this passage as a test of faith, a series of tests. And it might be a bit strange to say that concerning Elijah. You could say, oh yeah, the women, the widow, probably had trials, but how about Elijah? Well, yes. And his first test was right there. Should I dare to stand before the king? And should I dare to represent what God has said? And we know that he stood there, he said it, and then he had a chance to leave the palace. I don't know if it was because Ahab thought, well, this is just jibber-jabber, and none of it will ever come true. But for sure that in a short while, it turned out that what Elijah said was true and there was no rain. And Ahab starts chasing Elijah, puts out a search warrant, and persecutes him to death. So what kind of need would Elijah have now? Well, for one, he needs a hiding place, and he also needs food. He needs provision. And the next trial of faith, or test of faith, is what God said. God said, I have commanded certain animals to provide for you. I'm going to prepare a place for you. Look it up, go there, and the ravens are going to bring you food. They'll nourish you, and you can drink from the brook. Well, for us, thousands of years later, easy to read. But for Elijah, to hear that from God must not have been that easy. Enough to think that in Leviticus, God says there are certain unclean animals, and you're not supposed to eat their meat. And there's a list, and on that list you'll find a raven. Ravens are unclean birds. And in that sense,
Ilyen értelemben, hogyha
if
a hollók hoznak
the ravens bring food to Elijah,
illésnek,
then
akkor lehet, hogy az
could that food turn unclean as well?
Lehet, hogy akkor
Would
ez
then
inkább egy
this be
próba,
a trial,
sértés,
a test,
erre nemet kéne mondani.
or a temptation? Should he say no?
De hát
But
az Isten
God
azt mondja,
said,
hogy indulj
get
el.
going. All right,
Na jó,
but what guarantees
de mi
that if I
garantálja
get there,
azt,
there's going to be
hogy a
ravens?
tényleg lesznek ott?
What guarantees that they're not
Ki
going to find me
garantálja
there?
azt, hogy ott nem fognak
Who
találni?
guarantees that?
Ki garantálja azt?
Didn't God say that?
Hát nem Isten mondta.
Is it easy to obey?
És könnyű
Not always.
engedelmeskedni? Hát nem.
You have to get
El
going.
kell indulni.
You have to get to the
El kell
place
menni
in order to
odáig,
find out
hogy kiderüljön,
if
hogy tényleg
what God has said will be
történik-e
fulfilled.
az, amit az Isten mond.
If Elijah had
Ha
sat
Illés
down
leült volna, és elkezdte
waiting
volna várni,
for the
amíg
ravens to
azok
show up,
otthon van,
he would have
akkor
never
sose tapasztalja
experienced
meg azt,
that God said what God said was true.
kihívódik. Talán
He's struggling and he's probably thinking, he's grinding in his mind, what should I do with all these unclean animals? Is that really the way God wants to provide for me? But in spite of all of his doubts, he sets out and he goes to the brook.
és elmegy a patakig.
Maybe on his way,
Talán
he
közben
was
azon
thinking,
gondolkodik, hogy
why ravens? Ravens usually take things, they don't bring things.
a dolgokat, azok nem hozni
How are they going to take care of me?
Hogy fogják ezek ezt elintézni?
How am I going to stay alive?
Hogy fogok életben?
But then he gets there and then he lives to see that miracle. Because God gave him leading and God provided for him. But as we could see last week, this didn't last forever because the brook dried up by which he stayed. What's going to happen to me? What am I going to do now? Things went so well so far. God promised what he would do and he did it. Super. So, and now things run out. Provision runs out. Food ceases to exist. What am I going to do now? And the next test of faith comes for Elijah. God says, arise and go to Zarephath belonging to Sidon. Sidon was a heathen town in the territory of Phoenicia, and it's north of Israel, and it was an enemy of Israel. And then God says, go, not only that you go to a pagan land, but you go amongst the enemies. And if this was all not enough, on top of it, Sidon was a city-state that Jezebel came from. Ahab's wicked wife came from Sidon. In fact, Jezebel's father was the king of Sidon. Interesting that Solomon blew it right there in Sidon also, because he took a wife from that city. And we can read that a couple of chapters earlier in 1 Kings 11, chapter 11, first 5 verses I'm going to read you. But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites. Of the nations concerning which the Lord said, unto the children of Israel, ye shall not go into them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass, when Solomon was old, and his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites.
És rávették arra, hogy más isteneket tiszteljen és imádjon. Így Salamon Astóretet, a szidóniak istennőjét, és Milkómot, az ammóniak utálatos bálványát is tisztelte.
shocking to read that.
Döbbenetes ezt olvasni,
What led to the
hogy
downfall of
miben
Solomon?
bukik el Salamon. Hogy
That he lets into temptation
enged a kísértésnek,
and
és
takes a
elveszi
woman
Szidónból
from
levő
Sidon
őt,
amongst the other women he already had, and they turn
és
his head away
elfordítják a fejét.
to idols.
A bálványokhoz fordítják a fejét.
This was not such a long
Nem olyan
time
nagyon
before,
régen volt ez.
and now in my time,
A mi
Elijah could
időnkben
think,
gondolhatja így.
here's Ahab doing the
Itt
same
van
thing.
Áháb, aki ugyanezt csinálja.
He takes the
Szidóni
daughter of the
király
king of Sidon
feleségét veszi el,
and
és olyan bálványimádásba
takes
sodorja az
the
országot,
country
hogy
down
sose volt.
in the path of idol
És
worship
akkor
like never
most azt
before.
mondja nekem az Isten,
And then Elijah could say, should I now go to Sidon, to that city, to that very city? What am I going to do there?
mit keressek én ott?
If they see me there,
Azonnal kiadnak
they're going to turn me over to
Hát hogy
Jezebel
fogok
right away.
gondoskodni Isten?
This is not a good hiding
Se
place.
nem jó
It's not a good
rejtett
place to begin with.
egyáltalán nem jó hely.
How could God think such a thing?
Gondolta ezt Isten. Vajon
Could it be that I misunderstood what he said?
lehet, hogy
Could it just be a test from God?
próbál az Isten?
Couldn't be God's will.
Biztos nem lehet az Isten akarata. Hát aki ilyen pogányságra képes,
Somebody who's such a pagan that turns the entire Israel away from God, I should stay away from that.
nem oda menni,
This couldn't be God's will.
ez biztos nem Isten akarata.
And Elijah still sets out.
És mégis elindul.
And I was thinking that this was maybe Elijah's super ability, that in spite of all of his struggle and doubt,
Minden vívódás
he still
ellenére mégis
sets out, he's still willing to let
csak
God.
hajlandó engedni az Istennek.
He's risking
Megkockáztatni
of being caught, being turned
elkapják,
over to Jezebel,
kiadják,
because
Jézabelnek,
he is going to her homeland after all, but because God said,
Isten azt mondta,
he will go and obey.
és enged neki.
And when it seems that,
És amikor úgy
okay,
tűnik, hogy na,
Elijah won over his own temptations and doubts, there comes the next test of faith. God is sending him to a widow who will provide for him, but we spoke about it briefly last week. Poor widow didn't know much about this mission, as if God had not told her that she was going to be the one providing for Elijah. And when Elijah is on his way, maybe he's thinking, why isn't God sending me to a goodly Jewish woman? He could have found hundreds of those that would have taken me in gladly. Why do I have to go to another country, a strange land, to a heathen land? Why do I have to look for a Phoenician, unknown widow? Why does a pagan have to provide for me, a stranger? Will there really be someone like that? Will there be somebody who's willing to provide for me? Well, maybe one, since God said it, but how am I going to find her? And so I was reminded of that story of Abraham when he sends his servant out to look for a wife for his son Isaac. And the servant is in deep trouble. How am I going to find that woman for Isaac, an adequate wife for Isaac? And he prays, please give me a sign that I might see which young women did you intend for Isaac. And then we remember that he says, I'm going to ask for a meal and to eat and drink, and then if a woman offers to give a drink to my camels, I'll take it as a sign that that's the woman. So that servant will ask for a favor, and by this he hopes to see the sign, whether it's the chosen one for Isaac. And something similar happens to Elijah. He gets there, meets a woman, but he doesn't know that this is the right woman. There's not a halo over her head, no star shining above her head. She's probably quite worn out, gathering sticks for the fire, malnourished. But Elijah asks her and asks for a favor. And that woman is ready to give him a meal, but then it turns out
kiderül,
and things are
hogy
not looking very bright,
olyan fényes a helyzet.
as one might
Hogy
hope.
azt talán remélni lehetne.
He meets the woman,
Találkozik az asszonnyal, és amikor
and when he
enni
asks for
kívánnak,
a meal,
asszony
turns out that the woman's got nothing.
hát mi van?
He might have doubts like, did I blow it? Should I be maybe looking for another woman? But I don't see anybody around here. God couldn't be serious about this. He promised to provide for me. Why would he send me to somebody who doesn't have food herself? What should I do with this woman?
Kezdjek ezzel az egész.
It's a little bit like as if God is ratcheting on the tension. This is the third test of faith in which Elijah obeys, and the situation is not getting any easier. In fact, it's seemingly getting more difficult. Things are becoming more and more impossible. And this is how faith works. This is how it can grow.
Így tud növekedni.
That when you don't see any chance left of God's promise being fulfilled, that it would be realized, the things that I've heard and have seen from Him, yet I decide to believe Him. This is called faith. When you don't see it, when you don't even see the mere chance of it being fulfilled, yet you decide to believe. Of course, for that you need God's word, because if you try to stand on your own desires, they're not going to save you. We know fairly little of what goes on inside Elijah, but with these struggles and with these battles, how he managed with those. But for sure we know he's not a machine. We know from later chapters that he can get tired, he can fall into depression, he's not untouchable. He's not somebody that is untouched by difficulties. He's a man subject to like passion as we are. Battles the same things that we do. And he needs to struggle to believe God and to obey. But the Spirit of God somehow calls within him and he obeys and he reacts. And still he goes on. And he still goes on to obey. And this is how God's work works out. This is how His provision works. This is how we can experience Him in our lives. That God says something, He calls us, He invites us to something. Usually it's not just a little talk conveniently, but He usually calls us to something specific. Go here, go there, do this, do that, forsake that, do something else. And then you can decide what you're going to do with that. Because these callings from God, these invitations, they're always going to cause a crisis for us. They're always going to try our faith. And then I have to decide what am I going to do with that. Will I believe God? Am I ready to adjust myself, to conform myself to Him and obey? Or that I can't give up my logic and I can't give up my own ideas? Well, I will only experience God personally if I'm ready to let Him, if I'm willing to trust Him. And then you will experience Him and you will see what He's able to do. Just like Job said at the end of his struggle, up until now, I have only heard about you with my ears. I've known a lot about you. I could talk about you, but now I've seen Him with my own eyes. And this is similar for us. We only can get to know God by experience. We've heard about Him, we've read about Him, but He stays distant until we're willing to adjust our lives to Him and believe, finally, that whatever He says, even if it seems impossible, will be fulfilled. And somehow, Elijah manages through this test of faith and goes with the woman. And he says, there will be enough to eat. Just bring me first,
Először, és aztán majd
and then God will provide you as well.
fog rólad gondoskodni az Isten.
And
És nyilván
obviously, this woman
asszony is
has
kapott
her own
próbára,
tests of faith
mert
because she needs to believe that something will come of this.
kellett, hogy hozzon először illésnek.
So first she needed to make some food for Elijah in order to find out that God will provide for her, that there will be a miracle.
Hát
The story could end right here. How wonderful it is. They both fought lots of battles of faith. They struggled through and they managed to overcome. But it's not the end of the story because there comes the next test of faith. And again, there's this question, how do you know God? What do you think of God?
Milyennek ismerem én az Istent? Mit gondolok róla? Milyennek tartom őt?
What do you think is his disposition towards you? What is his attitude towards you? What do you think of God? We don't know much about this woman. She lives in a pagan country, but she recognizes the prophet from his clothing, from his hair or his beard, I don't know. But when she starts talking with Elijah, she puts it this way, the Lord, thy God, not my God, but she says, thy God. So she knows who she's talking with. It's a Jewish prophet who's got a God, but it's a God that is not hers yet. I don't have much to do with that God yet. But in spite of that, she experiences a great miracle. She doesn't have to die of starvation. There's going to be enough food to eat. Everything is nice and fine. But then tragedy hits, unexpected event. Kid suddenly falls ill. And what we read is that his situation got so sore that there was no breath left in him, practically died. And the woman just freaks out and she says, why did you come here? To remind me of my sons and to remind me of my sins and slay my son? It's a very interesting way she puts it. It tells us a little bit what could have been raging in her soul, what was consuming her for years. And maybe she managed to suppress it for a while, but now, when trouble hits, when the crisis is here, then all of this will now surface again. We don't know what the woman meant when she said, did you come to remind me of my sins? But it doesn't even matter. When you know that you have sin in your life, then it doesn't matter what it is, because that one sin is depressing you. And it's constantly accusing you. And you can suppress it for a while, but it surfaces again and again. And it consumes you, it eats away at you, it eats up your joy, your strength, your joy, your faith, until you settle it. And one thing for sure, from what the women said, the women had a sin that was not settled. And she feels this sin is so heavy that she almost feels that it's a rightful act from God. It's a rightful judgment what happened, or at least that's the way she interprets it. That God was willing to wait up until this point, but now he's going to turn in the bill. And the women couldn't even say God is not right. She knows, I know he's right. And now judgment will be executed. What do you think of God? How is he thinking about me? In the New Testament, Peter and others say when they meet God, get thee away from me, for I'm a sinful man. When man faces God, it could be in a difficult situation, it could be any situation, but when you suddenly wake up to the fact who you are and who you are compared to God, you say, get thee away from me, for I'm a sinful man. What do you think of God? The one who can't wait to punish me,
hogy megbüntethesse.
All right, he's
Na jó,
merciful.
hát kegyelmes,
He's
úgyhogy
probably
visszaszorított foggal még itt
squeezing his
néhány
teeth
hetet,
and waiting
néhány
for a few more
hónapot
weeks and a
vár,
few more months that I might change.
hogy hát ha változok,
But then when the time is up,
de aztán letelik ez az
then
idő,
judgment will fall.
és aztán jön
Punishment
a
will
büntetés. Jön
will
a
come.
büntetés.
What do you think of
Milyen
God?
ismerem én
Who
az
is he?
Istent? Kicsoda ő?
What does he think
Hogy
about man?
gondolkodik az emberről?
An unexpected, tragical event,
Tragikus esemény
and that will bring it all to the surface.
előhozza
Your doubts, your questions.
a kérdéseket. És döbbenet az, hogy nem csak
And it's
az
quite
az,
shocking it's not only the women struggling with this question,
mert hogy
but in
ebben
this
a
situation,
helyzetben
Elijah
Illés is,
also is
egy nagyon
facing a
komoly
very serious
kérdés előtt.
question.
Milyen az az Isten,
What
aki
kind of
ezt
God could
megengedi?
allow such a thing? How could he do
Tehette
that?
ezt az Isten?
And he starts bargaining or arguing with God,
vitatkozni az Istennel.
and
És
it's almost a little bit like
majdnem olyan, mintha számolna
Elijah is
az Isten.
calling, is
Azt mondja
taking,
neki,
is accounting God for what happened.
ez az özvegyasszony befogadott engem a házába, és most
Elijah says,
bajt hozol,
this woman took me into her house, and now you're going to bring such evil to her house that you slay her son? What do you think of God?
Na jó, igaz,
Well, it's
hogy
true that
az ember az ő
we're
teremtménye.
God's creation, but God already said that he regretted ever creating man. God has grown cold. He had enough of us being sinful, unfaithful, can't obey. We can't hang on to him, constantly just aggravating God with our corruptness. God is mad at us. He can't wait to drop judgment on our head because his holiness cannot tolerate sin. How do you know God? What do you think of him? And Elijah struggles with that. He knows the holy God, but he also knows that the holy God cannot tolerate sin. Is it possible that this woman is going to punish this woman now by killing her son? My God, how could you do such a thing? And as if he was even accusing himself, saying, she took me in, and you bring such evil to her house by sending me here, by saying that you're going to provide for me through her. Is this going to be the result of all that? Is this what it's going to cause? What kind of God are you? Who are you? If we don't allow Christ's death to answer the question, what is God's disposition towards us, then we're going to be grinding in doubt forever. Then we'll never know what God thinks of us. We live in the New Testament, and we could almost say that we're in a privileged situation compared to Elijah and the widow, because we know a lot more. Yet, so many times we have the same questions, and we're struggling. What is God like? Who's the God that I decided to serve? Can I live up to him? Is God really like that? Is God really like that? The God who, when I never knew nothing about him, lived in my sins, he already gave his son for me, who died on the cross for you and I. The God who loved us in advance, who searched us out while we were yet sinners and came after us. No, that God is not like that. That's not his attitude. His attitude is love. And let me read you that quote once again. For me, this is very important. If we don't allow Christ's death to give us the answer on what is God's dispositions towards us, then we'll be grinding in doubt forever. because then we'll always be looking at the circumstances, trying to measure how is my standing with God. And I won't be thinking what He's done for me, and I'm not going to hang on to what He said, that He loved me, that He gave His life for me. Well, for Elijah and the widow had to struggle with that question. What is God like? And maybe this was the biggest test of faith for both of them. And God will lead me into situations like that, where He will ask us also, who do you think of me? Or what do you think of me? Who do you think I am? And the situation will cry loudly, where it's going to say, what is your God like? What do you think of Him? Elijah, instead of cursing that God, says, he says, oh my God, please let the soul of this child come into him again. And as he stretches himself over the kid, God listens to his prayer. And I was thinking, it's not what he does and how he does it. That's not the miracle itself. But the miracle is that Elijah still calls on God, and after all this, still asks for God's help. And God listens to his prayer. And it's shocking how this chapter ends by the women formulating this. Now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in thy mouth is true. They had to come to that point so that this woman, who first said, thy God, your Lord, could say that indeed you're a man of God and you're saying His word. How does God provide? Well, not as we would expect it, not the way we would imagine it, in a much more peculiar way. And at the end, it turns out that Elijah didn't have to go to this pagan city by accident. He could have gone any place else. God could have taken him any place. But he decided that he wanted to help this woman who didn't even know what great problem she will be facing. But God knew that in advance. And He managed the path of His prophet to lead him there, to this woman. Because God has never even given up on that pagan woman. He even helped her. This is an awesome God. It's just amazing how He cares for us, how He leads our path. Sometimes He brings people to us, people that we don't even know. We would never even expect them to come, and they still help us in some way. Sometimes He takes us near others that we might become a blessing in some way for them. And God leadeth our path, and He provides for us. He cares for us, and many times He uses us in others' lives. It's astounding. But it's not automatic. This path is full of tests of faith. And if you manage to stand and overcome these tests, if you can risk whether God is truthful and right, if you can let Him, then you will start getting to know Him by experience. And I wish that this period would be all about this. I don't know why God allows this whole virus situation, this lockdown, the quarantine. And I don't know exactly what His plan is with all this, but one thing for sure, that these situations are invitations. God calls us to Himself. He calls us back to Himself. And maybe He wants to say something. Maybe He's calling us to obedience. And maybe it's not easy to say yes to that. But if we manage, then we're going to start getting to know Him by experience. And we're going to find out that God is the same God as before. And He works the same way in our lives. And His hand is not shortened. His power is not lessened. He's not weaker. He didn't draw afar. He's still here. And He's still working in the life of His own. And I wish that in our church this might become more obvious. But the way it could happen, that is if we each individually, we start risking, or I should say trust in our God, and we start believing what He said, and we start standing on those promises, and then we will live through these two experiences, and then we'll have a hard time keeping it within us. And then as we're going to pass it on to others, it's going to be a service to others. And I wish we would have more of these type of testimonies in which we experience the work of the great God.